What if the world had already ended once and almost no one remembers it? What if there was a beginning before our beginning? A story that the Earth started to tell and then, for reasons no one fully understands, fell silent. Somewhere beneath the soil and the ice, beneath the layers we walk on without thinking, lies the outline of a loss so old it has no name we can trust. Tonight, there is no need to hold on to anything. So before you let your body sink fully into this stillness, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what is being made here. And if you would, leave behind the name of the place where you are listening and the hour of your local time so that others drifting towards sleep in the dark might know they are not alone. The cold came back. That is the simplest way to say it. For thousands of years, the great ice sheets of the northern world had been retreating, the planet warming, the long winter of the last glacial age finally loosening its grip. Forests crept northward, rivers swelled with meltwater, and then, around 12,900 years ago, in the space of perhaps a single human lifetime, the warming reversed. The temperature in the north plunged, the ice returned. For roughly 1,200 years, the world was thrown back into something close to the depths of the Ice Age, and then, just as abruptly, the cold released its hold again, and the warmth returned for good. Scientists call this strange interruption the Younger Dryas, named after a small white Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen settled into the lake beds of Europe in such quantity during those cold centuries that it left a visible signature in the layers of mud. A flower gave its name to a catastrophe. There is something almost tender in that, and something unsettling too, because the flower bloomed precisely because so much else was dying. The question that has haunted researchers for generations is not whether the Younger Dryas happened. The ice cores of Greenland record it with brutal clarity, the temperature line dropping like a stone, and then, more than a millennium later, leaping back up. The question is what caused it, and what it cost. For at almost exactly the same moment that the cold returned, three other things happened across the Americas. The great beasts began to vanish. The people who hunted them disappeared from the archaeological record, and a thin, dark layer settled across the continent, sealing the old world away beneath it like a lid closing on a tomb. Coincidence is a word that scientists use carefully, because the universe is full of things that merely happen to occur together. But three endings at once, all bound to the same narrow window of time, is the kind of pattern that refuses to let the mind rest. So who are the advanced ancients of the title, and what does it mean to call them advanced? Here the ground grows soft and uncertain, because the phrase carries two very different meanings depending on who speaks it. To most archaeologists, the people of that age were skilled hunter-gatherers of remarkable sophistication, masters of stone and fire and migration, but not builders of cities or keepers of writing. To others, voices at the edges of the academy and far beyond it, the phrase hints at something more, a vanished culture of knowledge and craft whose memory survives only in fragments and myth, erased so thoroughly by the cataclysm that we mistake their absence for proof they never existed. These two readings of the same silence will travel together through everything that follows, never quite agreeing, never quite letting each other go. What is certain is that the silence is real. Something happened at the threshold of the Younger Dryas, something violent enough to leave its mark on 3 continents and to bend the course of the climate itself. The conventional explanation has long been a quieter one, a story of meltwater and ocean currents, of the slow machinery of the planet stuttering. But in recent decades, a stranger and more dramatic possibility has forced its way into the conversation, carried by tiny grains of evidence pulled from the dark layer itself. It is the possibility that the sky fell, that something came down out of the heavens and changed the world in an afternoon, and that the long cold was its shadow. The trouble is that the thing which fell, if it fell at all, left almost no scar that anyone has been able to find. And so the search has turned inward, downward, into the soil, into the dust, into the things too small to see, For now it is enough to hold the shape of the mystery in the mind, a warming world that suddenly froze, a flower that bloomed over the graves of giants, a dark line drawn through the earth, with one world above it and another below. The people who study these things have spent their careers trying to read that line, the way one might try to read a single sentence torn from a book whose other pages have all burned. They disagree about almost everything, the cause, the scale, the meaning, even whether there is a meaning at all. But none of them can quite walk away from it, because the line is there and beneath it lies whatever was lost. There is a particular kind of unease that comes from realizing how thin the layer of recorded history truly is. Writing is perhaps 5,000 years old, cities not much older. Everything before that is reconstruction, inference, the patient reading of bones and stones and chemical traces. And the Younger Dryas sits more than twice as far back as the oldest written word, in a darkness so deep that an entire chapter of the human story could have unfolded and ended there without leaving a single legible page behind. The mind recoils from that thought and then returns to it, because the alternative is to assume that nothing of importance ever happens in the dark. And the dark, as it turns out, is very large. So the search begins not with grand monuments or lost cities, but with mud, with the unglamorous patient work of cutting into the ground and reading the layers as they were laid down, year upon year, age upon age. Somewhere in those layers there is a line that should not be there, a band of darkness that marks the moment everything changed. To understand what killed the world of the advanced ancients, one must first learn to find that line, and then to ask what it is made of, and why it lies exactly where it does. The earth keeps its records faithfully. It is only the reading of them that breaks the heart. Beneath the floors of caves and along the cut banks of dry streams across much of North America, there runs a thin, dark stratum that geologists have come to treat almost as a boundary marker between two ages of the world. They call it the black mat. It is rarely more than a few centimetres thick, a layer of dark, organic, rich sediment that drapes itself over the older soil like a shroud. And what makes it remarkable is not its appearance, but its timing, and what lies on either side of it. Below the black mat, the bones of great animals are abundant, the teeth of mammoths, the ribs of mastodons, the scattered remains of camels and horses and giant sloths that once roamed the American plains. Above the black mat, in layer after layer, at site after site, those bones simply stop. The old fauna does not gradually thin out. It ends. The geologist who did more than almost anyone to map this strange horizon spent decades documenting it across the American Southwest and beyond. What he found was a pattern of unnerving consistency. Again and again, the black mat appeared at the same level, marking the same moment in time, the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling. And again, it sat directly above the last traces of the megafauna and the people who had hunted them. It was as though the entire continent had drawn a single dark breath and held it, and when it exhaled, the old world was gone. The layer is so reliable, so consistent in its placement, that some researchers have come to use it as a kind of natural bookmark, a line in the earth that says, here, this is where the change occurred. But what is the black mat, really? The conventional reading is almost soothing in its ordinariness. As the climate cooled and shifted, the water table in many regions rose, and shallow wetlands and ponds spread across landscapes that had once been dry. In the still, oxygen-poor waters of these marshes, organic material accumulated and decayed slowly, staining the sediment dark. By this account, the black mat is simply the signature of a wetter, cooler world, a natural consequence of the climate turning. The animals died because their habitat changed, because the plants they depended on retreated, because the whole web of life that had sustained them frayed and came apart in the cold. It is a quiet death, drawn out, almost gentle in its slowness, a world dimming rather than a world struck, and yet the very consistency of the layer troubles some who study it. Why should the same dark line appear at the same instant across such an enormous range, from the deserts of Arizona to the plains of the interior and onward to sites scattered across other continents entirely? Wetlands form locally, in response to local conditions in their own time. A boundary that snaps into place everywhere at once suggests something more abrupt, something that's swept across the world rather than seeping into it. And so a second reading of the black mat emerged, one that sees in its darkness not merely the slow staining of marsh water, but the residue of fire and ruin, a record of something that happened to the whole sky at once. For those who hold this view, the black mat is not the boundary itself, but the aftermath, the settling dust of a catastrophe. Beneath its lowest edge, at the precise level where the old fauna ends, they began to look for things that should not be in ordinary soil, not bones this time, but particles, tiny spheres of once molten material, microscopic grains of carbon, and in some samples, vanishingly small crystals harder than anything ordinary fire could produce. The black mat in this telling became less a shroud than a sealed envelope, and the question became what message had been folded inside it, written in a script almost too small to read. There is a discipline in resisting the more dramatic explanation. The history of science is littered with catastrophes invoked too eagerly, with floods and impacts and sudden cataclysms summoned to explain patterns that turned out, on closer inspection, to have unfolded slowly and undramatically after all. The careful researcher learns to prefer the quiet answer, the gradual answer, the answer that requires nothing extraordinary. By that standard, the black mat should be nothing more than the fingerprint of a changing climate and the death of the megafauna, nothing more than the long, sad consequence of a world growing cold. But the careful researcher must also be honest about what the quiet answer leaves unexplained. Why the abruptness? Why the global reach? Why the same narrow band of time keeps appearing wherever one digs, binding together the cold and the dark layer and the vanishing of the giants and the disappearance of the people, as though they were not four separate events but four faces of a single one? The black mat does not answer these questions, it only insists on them. It lies there in the earth, patient and dark between the world that was and the world that came after, and it asks anyone who finds it to decide what kind of ending it represents. A slow, a fading, or a sudden blow. The answer changes everything that follows, and the layer itself will not say. The animals that vanished above that dark line were not small things easily overlooked. They were the largest creatures the Americas had ever known, and their disappearance left a silence that the continent has never entirely filled. Consider what was lost. The Columbian mammoth, taller at the shoulder than any living elephant, its tusks curving in great arcs. The American mastodon browsing the spruce forests. The giant ground sloth, a beast the size of an ox that walked on its knuckles and reached into the trees. The glyptodon, an armoured creature like a living dome. Dire wolves, short-faced bears standing taller than a man when they reared up. Native horses, native camels, a saber-toothed cat with blades for teeth. Within a geological instant, more than 30 genera of large mammals were gone from North America alone. The great die-off was not confined to one continent. Across the Americas, the world lost a menagerie that had taken millions of years to evolve. For more than a century, the cause of this extinction has been one of the most stubborn arguments in all of natural science, and the arguments fall, broadly, into three camps that have circled one another for generations. The first blames the climate. The world was changing rapidly at the end of the Ice Age, and the sudden reversal of the Younger Dryas, slamming the door on the warming, may have shattered ecosystems that the great beast depended on. Animals so large, so slow to breed, so demanding of food, are precisely the creatures least able to survive when their world is pulled out from under them. The cold killed them, this view says, by killing the abundance they needed to live. The second camp blames the hunters. As bands of humans spread across the Americas in the centuries before the extinction, they encountered animals that had never learned to fear an upright predator carrying sharpened stone. The overkill hypothesis holds that these naive giants were simply too easy to kill, and that a wave of skilled hunters, moving through a continent of unwary prey, drove the megafauna to extinction faster than they could adapt. It is a haunting idea that the first Americans may have arrived into a paradise of giants and, without ever intending it, hunted that paradise into memory. The timing is suggestive. The people and the great beasts vanished together near the same dark line. The third camp, the newest and the most contested, points upward. It argues that neither slow climate change nor human hunting can fully account for the sheer suddenness of the collapse, the way it seems to coincide so precisely with the onset of the cold and the laying down of the black mat. Something more violent, this view suggests, struck the world at that moment, and the extinction was its casualty list. This is the camp that looks for impact, for fire from the sky, for a single catastrophe that killed the giants, scattered the people, and froze the world all at once. It is the boldest claim, and the one for which the hardest evidence is demanded, and rightly so. What unsettles is that none of the three explanations on its own has ever fully closed the case. The climate argument struggles with the fact that the megafauna had survived many previous swings of cold and warm across the long ice age without going extinct. Why should this particular cold snap, the Younger Dryas, be the one that finished them when so many others had not? The overkill argument struggles with the scarcity of kill sites, with the question of how a thin scattering of human bands could have exterminated so many animals across two vast continents so quickly, and with the awkward fact that some of the lost species were not the kind that humans typically hunted. And the impact argument struggles above all with the absence of an obvious crater, a wound in the earth large enough to match the destruction it proposes. Perhaps the truth is a braid of all three. The giants weakened by a changing climate, pressed by human hunters, and then struck a final blow by some sudden event that tipped a fragile balance into collapse. Extinction is rarely the work of a single executioner, but even a braided explanation leaves the deepest unease intact, because all three threads converge on the same narrow moment, the same dark line, the same 1,200 years of returning cold. Whatever killed the great beasts of the Americas did so in concert with whatever scattered the people and whatever chilled the world. The synchrony is the mystery. Things that should have unfolded over thousands of years instead seem to have happened almost at once, and so the bones fall silent above the black mat, and the question of who silenced them hangs in the air. The mammoth left its great curved tusks in the frozen ground of the north, some so well preserved that the flesh remained on them when they were found thousands of years later, as though the animal had only just lain down. The giant sloth left its dung in the dry caves of the canyon country, undisturbed for over 10,000 years. These are not the relics of a slow and gentle fading. They are the leftovers of an interruption, a meal abandoned, a world that stopped mid-sentence. The giants did not so much die out as disappear, and the difference between those two words is the whole of the mystery. Somewhere in the same dark window, the people who had walked among them were disappearing too, and their vanishing carries a riddle all its own. The people of that age in North America are known by the shape of the stone they left behind. Archaeologists call them the Clovis culture, after the town in New Mexico where their distinctive weapons were first recognized, and for a long time they were thought to be the very first inhabitants of the Americas, the founding population from which all later peoples descended. That picture has since grown more complicated, with mounting evidence that humans reached the Americas earlier, perhaps far earlier than the Clovis people. But whatever came before them, the Clovis were real, widespread and remarkably uniform across an enormous territory, and they are bound to the mystery of the Younger Dryas as tightly as the giants they hunted. Their signature is a spear point of extraordinary craft. The Clovis point is leaf-shaped, finely flaked on both faces, and marked by a distinctive groove, a flute, struck from the base on each side so that the point could be fitted to a wooden shaft. To make such a point is difficult. The fluting in particular is a risky technique. a single misjudged blow capable of shattering hours of work in an instant. That this demanding method appears fully formed and consistent across thousands of kilometres of the continent speaks to a shared body of knowledge, a way of doing things passed carefully from hand to hand and generation to generation. The Clovis point is found from the eastern woodlands to the western deserts, embedded in some cases in the very bones of the mammoths and mastodons their makers hunted. For a few centuries, this was the dominant technology of human life across North America, and then, near the onset of the Younger Dryas, near the same dark line beneath which the giants vanish, the Clovis point disappears from the record. The technology does not slowly evolve into something else through a long series of intermediate forms. It ends, and is replaced by different traditions of tool-making, in some regions after an apparent gap. The people who made those elegant fluted blades stopped making them, and either died, dispersed, or transformed so completely that their old way of working stone was abandoned within a span that, in archaeological terms, looks almost instantaneous. A culture that had spread across a continent simply ceased to leave its characteristic mark. What happened to them? The most sober answer is that they adapted, as people always have. When the climate lurched and the great game animals they depended on collapsed, the Clovis way of life, built around hunting enormous beasts with those specialized spears, may simply have stopped making sense. People turned to smaller prey, to plants, to fish, to new tools suited to a changed world. The disappearance of the Clovis point in this reading is not the disappearance of a people, but the discarding of a technology that no longer served, the natural response of a flexible species to a world transformed. The descendants of the Clovis did not vanish. They became the many peoples who flourished across the Americas in the millennia that followed. That answer is almost certainly true in large part, and yet it does not entirely quiet the unease, because of the company the Clovis disappearance keeps. It happens alongside the extinction of the giants. It happens alongside the return of the cold. It happens at the level of the black mat. Once again, things that might each have an ordinary explanation are bound together by a single moment in time, and the binding is what demands attention. A culture changing its tools is unremarkable. A culture changing its tools at the exact instant the megafauna vanish, and the climate collapses and a dark layer settles over the continent, is something the mind cannot easily file away under ordinary. There is a deeper question hidden in the Clovis story, one that reaches toward the heart of the title, and its talk of advanced ancients. If a people could spread across an entire continent, develop a shared and demanding technology, hunt the largest animals on Earth, and then have their entire characteristic culture erased from the easily readable record within a few centuries, how much else might have vanished the same way? The Clovis are visible to us only because stone endures. Their spear points survive because they are made of the most durable material humans have ever worked. But a people who built in wood, in fibre, in earth, in anything that decays, would leave far less behind. Push the catastrophe back, or imagine a society that worked in perishable materials, and the silence above the black mat could conceal far more than the loss of one style of blade. This is the door through which the more radical readings of the Younger Dryas enter. Not the claim that the Clovis themselves were a lost advanced civilization, for the evidence does not support that, but the broader unsettling realization of how easily a sophisticated human world could disappear and leave us mistaking its absence for proof it was never there. The Clovis disappearance is a demonstration of how thoroughly the earth can swallow a culture. If the stone-tipped spears had been made of something softer, we might never have known the Clovis existed at all. We would look at the layers and see giants below and emptiness above, and we would have no idea that skilled and knowing people had once walked there. So the spear points lie in the museum drawers and the dry soil, beautiful and silent, the last clear signature of a way of life that ended near the dark line. And the question of what ended it, climate or hunting or something falling from the sky, is the same question that hangs over the giants and over the cold itself. To press toward an answer, the search must turn from the things humans made and the bones of beasts to the dust between them, to the microscopic debris scattered through the black mat, where a small and stubborn group of scientists believes the fingerprints of a cosmic catastrophe are waiting to be read. In the year 2007, a group of researchers published a proposal that landed in the scientific world like the very object they were describing. They argued that the onset of the Younger Dryas, the death of the megafauna, and the disappearance of the Clovis culture were not three coincidences, but three consequences of a single cause: a cosmic impact. They proposed that somewhere around 12,900 years ago, one or more large objects from space, most likely the fragments of a disintegrating comet, struck or exploded over North America, very possibly above the great ice sheet that still covered much of the continent. The blast and the firestorms it triggered, they suggested, devastated the land. The soot and dust it threw into the sky darkened and chilled the climate, and the world was plunged into the long cold of the Younger Dryas in consequence. This is the impact hypothesis, and it has been at war with the rest of its field ever since. The boldness of the claim was matched only by the difficulty of proving it, because the proposed impact had a glaring problem. There was no crater. A rock large enough to freeze the planet ought to have left an enormous wound somewhere on the Earth, and no such fresh wound of the right age could be found. The researchers had an answer for this, though a contested one. If the objects were fragments of a comet, loose and icy, rather than a single dense body, and if the largest of them detonated in the air or struck the soft, thick ice of the northern ice sheet rather than solid rock, then the impact might have left no permanent crater at all. The ice would have absorbed the blow and then, in the millennia since, melted away, carrying the evidence with it. It is a convenient argument, and its critics have never tired of saying so, but it is not on its face impossible. Airbursts leave scorched ground and scattered debris rather than holes, so the proponents went looking not for a crater but for debris, for the microscopic shrapnel that a violent impact or airburst would scatter across the landscape and seal into the sediment at the boundary. And in the thin layer just beneath the black mat, the layer they came to call the Younger Dryas boundary, they reported finding exactly the kinds of particles that such an event should produce. Tiny spheres of magnetic material, droplets of rock melted and refrozen in flight, carbon spherules and soot, the residue of intense fire, grains of glass-like material formed at temperatures far higher than any ordinary wildfire or human hearth could reach. And, most strikingly, nanodiamonds, diamonds so small they can be seen only with the most powerful microscopes, including a rare form whose structure, they argued, can be created only by the shock of extraordinary pressure, the kind of pressure delivered by a cosmic impact. There was for a time another kind of evidence that some hoped might point toward the falling object, not microscopic this time, but written across the land itself. Along the Atlantic coastal plain of North America, there lie hundreds of thousands of shallow elliptical depressions known as the Carolina Bays, oval basins scattered across the landscape, many of them aligned in a strikingly consistent direction, as though something had swept across the region from a single source. To some observers, beginning long before the modern impact hypothesis, these oriented ovals looked like scars, the marks left by a rain of debris hurled out from a great impact, perhaps the very impact that ended the world of the giants. The alignment seemed too orderly to be the work of ordinary erosion, and the idea that the bays were the footprints of a cosmic catastrophe has a long and stubborn history. But careful dating has steadily undermined the impact reading. The bays, it turns out, did not all form at once. They span an enormous range of ages, many of them far older than the Younger Dryas, and their shapes are better explained by the slow action of wind and water on the sandy coastal soils over tens of thousands of years than by any single violent event. The oriented ovals are real and beautiful and strange, but most who study them now see in them the patient sculpting of the elements rather than the shrapnel of a fallen star. To the proponents, the microscopic assemblage was a smoking gun without a barrel. They reported finding it not at one site, but at many dozens of locations scattered across North America and beyond, all at the same stratigraphic level, all dating to the same narrow window of time. A continent-wide, perhaps hemisphere-wide layer of impact debris laid down at the precise moment the cold returned and the giants died and the people scattered. If the evidence held, it would mean that the great mystery of the Younger Dryas had an answer written in dust, and that answer was fire from the heavens. The advanced ancients, whoever they were, would have perished not from slow climate change or the press of hunters, but from a single afternoon when the sky came apart. But the evidence has not simply held, nor has it simply fallen. From the beginning, other scientists challenged nearly every piece of it. The magnetic spherules, they said, could form in ordinary ways, in volcanic eruptions, in industrial pollution, even in the slow rain of micrometeorites that constantly settles on the Earth. The soot and carbon could come from ordinary wildfires, common in any landscape, and the nanodiamonds, the most dramatic claim of all, became the fiercest battleground. Skeptical researchers reported that when they examined boundary sediments, they found no spike in these tiny diamonds at all, and that what others had identified as the rare shock-formed variety might be something else entirely, ordinary forms of carbon misread under the strain of expectation. The debris that the proponents called a fingerprint, the critics called noise. This is the strange and difficult heart of the impact hypothesis. The evidence is real in the sense that something is being found in the boundary layer. The disagreement is about what it is and what it means. The same grains, examined by different laboratories, are read in opposite ways, one team seeing the unmistakable signature of catastrophe, another seeing the ordinary background of the world misinterpreted. It is a debate in which the objects in question are mostly too small to see with the naked eye, in which the difference between proof and illusion comes down to the calibration of instruments and the interpretation of microscopic crystals. Few scientific arguments are so dependent on so little, and few have been fought so bitterly for so long. What makes the dispute so hard to resolve is that both sides can point to genuine difficulties in the other. The proponents must explain the missing crater and the failure of some laboratories to reproduce their findings. The skeptics must explain why, if there was no impact, so many of the proposed signatures keep turning up at the same level across such a wide area. Neither side has delivered the single decisive blow that would end the argument. And so the question hangs in its peculiar suspension, neither proven nor disproven, kept alive by the very thing that makes it so hard to settle, the fact that the evidence is dust, and dust can be read in more than one way. There is one element of the proposed evidence, however, that has proven harder to dismiss than the rest, an element that does not depend on tiny crystals or contested spheres, but on the chemistry of a single rare metal. And the place it was found is not in the soil of the American plains, but locked deep in the ice of Greenland, in a frozen archive that records the climate of the past with a precision that mud can never match. To the ice, then, the search must turn, where the years are stacked like the pages of a book, and one of those pages carries a stain of something that fell. The ice of Greenland remembers. Each year, snow falls on the great sheet and is buried by the snow of the year that follows, and the layers compress into ice, trapping within them the dust and chemistry of the air at the moment they formed. Drill a core down through that ice, and you drill down through time, year by year, century by century, until you reach snow that fell tens of thousands of years ago. The bubbles hold ancient air, the chemistry holds ancient temperatures, and in this frozen record the Younger Dryas appears not as a vague suggestion, but as a sharp and undeniable event, the temperature signal plunging at the onset, and more than 1,000 years later, leaping back up so quickly that the change may have unfolded across mere decades. The ice does not deal in maybes. It shows the cold returning, and it shows it leaving, with a clarity that no other record can match. It was in this ice, at the level corresponding to the onset of the Younger Dryas, that researchers reported finding something that should not be there in such abundance, a spike of platinum. Platinum is rare in the Earth's crust, but it is far more common in certain kinds of meteorites and cometary material, where it occurs in proportions quite unlike anything ordinarily found on the surface of our planet. When scientists measured the platinum in the Greenland ice across the relevant span, they found that at one precise level it surged far above its normal background, a sudden enrichment that then faded away. And the chemical signature of that platinum, the ratio in which it appeared alongside other elements, did not match ordinary terrestrial sources. It matched instead the kind of material that comes from space. The date of the spike, as read from the ice layers, fell remarkably close to the proposed moment of catastrophe, near the year 10,950, before the Common Era, give or take a margin of uncertainty. Here, then, was a piece of evidence harder to wave away than scattered microspheres. A clear chemical anomaly, dated precisely by the most reliable climate archive on Earth, pointing toward an influx of extraterrestrial material at almost exactly the moment the world turned cold. To the proponents of the impact hypothesis, the platinum spike was a powerful confirmation, a fingerprint not in the soft and arguable soil, but in the hard and faithful ice. The metal of the heavens raining down at the threshold of the long winter, and yet even this, the strongest single thread, does not weave the case shut. Skeptics have noted that the platinum anomaly, while real, does not by itself prove a continent-shattering impact. A surge of extraterrestrial dust does not require a civilization-ending event. The Earth is constantly dusted with material from space, and an unusual pulse of it might reflect something far less dramatic than a comet striking the ice sheet. The platinum tells us that something from beyond the Earth arrived in unusual quantity at that moment. It does not, on its own, tell us that this something was large enough to freeze the planet and exterminate its giants. The spike narrows the mystery without solving it. It establishes that the heavens were involved, and leaves open the question of how deeply. There is a quiet poetry in the idea that the truth of so vast an event might be preserved in something so still and silent as a column of ice. While the soil of the continents was churned and weathered and disturbed by water and root and time, the ice of Greenland simply lay there, accumulating, keeping its perfect chronological order, holding each year's testimony in sequence. The platinum settled onto the snow and was buried and forgotten, and it waited there in the dark and the cold for nearly 13,000 years until human hands drilled down and brought it back into the light. Whatever fell from the sky at the onset of the Younger Dryas, the ice caught a trace of it and kept it, indifferent to all the arguments that trace would one day provoke. But the ice records more than a single moment of falling metal. It records the shape of the cooling itself, and that shape has long supported a very different and far less dramatic explanation for the entire Younger Dryas, one that has nothing to do with comets at all. For the prevailing view among many climate scientists has never been that an impact froze the world, but that the world froze itself through the disruption of a vast circulation of water in the oceans, a vast and delicate engine of heat that the melting of the Ice Age had begun to choke. To understand the cold, then, one must understand not only what may have fallen from the sky, but what was happening in the sea, where a different kind of catastrophe was quietly building. The ocean carries heat the way a river carries water, in great currents that circle the globe and redistribute the warmth of the tropics toward the poles. In the North Atlantic, warm surface water flows northward, gives up its heat to the air, grows cold and dense, and sinks into the deep, beginning a long return journey along the ocean floor. This sinking is the engine that keeps the whole circulation turning, and it is the reason that lands bordering the North Atlantic enjoy a far milder climate than their latitude alone would grant them. The warmth that reaches them is carried on this oceanic conveyor, and the conveyor depends on the cold northern water being heavy enough to sink. And what makes seawater heavy is its salt. As the Ice Age ended and the great northern ice sheets melted, they released staggering quantities of fresh water into the seas. For a long time, the conventional explanation of the Younger Dryas has centered on a sudden, enormous pulse of this meltwater flooding into the North Atlantic, perhaps from the catastrophic draining of a vast glacial lake that had pooled along the edge of the retreating ice. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. Pour enough of it across the Northern Ocean, and the surface water can no longer grow dense enough to sink. The conveyor stalls, the warmth stops flowing north, and the lands around the North Atlantic, deprived of the heat they had come to depend on, plunge back into something close to Ice Age cold. By this account, the Younger Dryas was a self-inflicted wound, the planet's own meltwater throttling the current that warmed it. No comet required. This explanation has much to recommend it. It requires nothing from the heavens. It draws on processes that scientists understand and can model, and even observe in fainter forms today. It accounts for why the cooling was felt most sharply around the North Atlantic, in Europe and the northern reaches of the Americas, precisely where a stalled conveyor would do the most damage. And it fits the abruptness, for once the delicate balance of the current is tipped, the change can come quickly. For many researchers, this oceanic story remains the leading explanation, the sober and sufficient answer, and they regard the talk of comets as an unnecessary intrusion of drama into a problem that ordinary climate physics can already solve. Yet the meltwater story has its own loose threads. The search for the precise flood that supposedly triggered the cooling, the exact channel down which the glacial lake drained at the exact moment required, has proven frustrating, with the evidence for the expected outflow harder to pin down than the theory demands. And the meltwater account, even if correct about the mechanism of the cold, says nothing about the other endings bound to the same moment: the death of the giants, the disappearance of the Clovis, the platinum in the ice, the contested debris in the boundary layer. A stalled ocean current can chill a hemisphere, but it does not obviously scatter melted spherules across a continent or enrich the snow with the metal of meteorites. This is where the two great explanations of the Younger Dryas circle each other most closely, and where a tantalizing possibility emerges that they need not be enemies at all. What if both are true? What if something did fall from the sky, striking or exploding over the northern ice sheet, and what that impact did was not to freeze the world directly through its dust and soot alone, but to shatter and rapidly melt a portion of the ice, releasing a sudden surge of fresh water into the North Atlantic and stalling the conveyor? In such a scenario, the comet is the trigger, and the ocean is the mechanism, the blow from above setting in motion the catastrophe in the sea. The fire and the flood would be one story, the heavens and the ocean conspiring to bring the long cold. It is an elegant idea, and elegance is no guarantee of truth. Combining two hypotheses can resolve their separate difficulties, but it can also simply multiply the assumptions required, demanding both an unproven impact and an unproven flood, each leaning on the other for support. The careful mind notes that a theory which needs two miracles is not obviously stronger than one that needs only one. And yet the convergence is hard to ignore, because the meltwater and the impact both point to the same place, the Great Northern Ice Sheet, as the stage on which the catastrophe played out. Whether the ice was melted slowly by a warming world or shattered suddenly by a falling object, it is the ice that holds the answer, and the ice that has largely melted away, carrying its secret with it. So the question of the cold remains poised between fire and water, between the dramatic and the mundane, with evidence pointing in both directions and a possible bridge between them that satisfies no one completely. The ocean current, if it stalled, would have done so silently, invisibly, a vast machine slowing in the dark of the deep. There would be no scar to find, no crater, only the consequence written in the chilled chemistry of the ice and the spreading of that flower over the graves of the giants. And if something did fall to set it all in motion, the most likely place for it to have struck was the one place where a wound would heal itself completely, melting back into the sea. The catastrophe, if it happened, may have erased its own crime scene, which is precisely why, for a brief and electric moment, the discovery of an enormous crater hidden beneath the Greenland ice seemed about to change everything. In the year 2018, researchers announced a discovery that sent a charge through everyone who had ever wondered about the Younger Dryas. Beneath the Hiawatha glacier in the far northwest of Greenland, hidden under nearly a kilometre of ice, they had found a crater, and not a small one. The depression measured some 31 kilometres across, a circular scar large enough to swallow an entire city, detected by radar that could see through the ice to the bedrock below. It had all the features expected of an impact crater: the rounded rim, the central uplift, the disturbed rock. Here, at last, beneath the very ice sheet where the impact hypothesis had always insisted the blow had landed, was a wound of the right kind in very nearly the right place. The only question that mattered was its age. For the proponents of the impact hypothesis, the discovery seemed almost too perfect. They had argued for years that a comet or asteroid had struck the northern ice sheet around 12,900 years ago, that the ice had absorbed the blow, and that the evidence had melted away. And now here was an enormous crater, found exactly where the ice still lay thick, in a region the ice sheet had covered through the relevant time. If this crater was young, if it dated to the onset of the Younger Dryas, then the missing smoking gun would be found. The central objection to the whole hypothesis answered. One leading proponent declared his confidence that the crater would prove to be the same age as the Younger Dryas. The hope was enormous, and for a few years the question hung open. The crater unfathomed, its age unknown, the entire argument waiting on a single number. But the ice that had hidden the crater also made it almost impossible to study directly, for no one could drill through a kilometre of glacier to sample the crater floor. Instead, researchers gathered grains of sand and rock that meltwater had carried out from beneath the glacier, fragments that had been heated and altered by the ancient impact, and they subjected these to the most rigorous dating methods available. Two separate laboratories, in two different countries, using two entirely different techniques, set out to determine when the Hiawatha impact had occurred. One heated grains of sand and measured the argon gas they released. The other examined tiny crystals of zircon, reading the slow radioactive decay locked inside them. And in the year 2022, both laboratories announced their answer, and the two answers agreed. The crater was not young. It was not 12,900 years old. It was approximately 58 million years old. The impact that carved that great scar beneath the Greenland ice had happened in the age that followed the death of the dinosaurs, when northwestern Greenland was not a frozen waste at all, but a temperate rainforest, a warm green land where creatures resembling hippopotamuses and crocodiles moved through the trees. The asteroid or comet that struck there fell more than 50 million years before the first human being walked the Earth, more than 4,000 times further back in time than the Younger Dryas. The crater was real, the impact was real, but it had nothing whatsoever to do with the long cold or the death of the giants. The smoking gun, examined at last, had been fired in another age entirely. There is a hard honesty in how this unfolded, and it deserves to be honoured. A bold prediction had been made. The crater would be Younger Dryas in age, the proponents had said. The test was run carefully twice by independent teams, and the prediction failed. The crater was ancient. This is precisely how science is supposed to work, a claim put to the test, and the test allowed to deliver its verdict even when the verdict disappoints. The researchers who dated the crater, including some who had no stake in the controversy, treated the result not as a triumph over rivals, but simply as the truth, arrived at and reported. The Hiawatha crater took its place in the record as a remarkable Paleocene impact, a window into the Earth's deep past, and it quietly withdrew from the story of the Younger Dryas. For the impact hypothesis, the dating of Hiawatha was a serious blow, though not a fatal one. It removed what had briefly looked like the strongest possible evidence, the actual crater, and it reminded everyone that an impact large enough to freeze the world should leave a wound, and that no such wound of the right age has ever been found anywhere on Earth. The proponents returned to their argument that the objects were comet fragments, that they detonated in the air or struck ice that has since vanished, that the absence of a crater is exactly what their scenario predicts. But the failure of Hiawatha sharpened the central difficulty rather than easing it. A theory that explains the absence of all physical craters by appealing to airbursts and melted ice asks a great deal of faith, and the brief hope that Hiawatha might supply the missing scar only made its loss more painful. And so the search circled back to where it had been before the crater was found, to the microscopic debris, to the platinum, to the contested grains in the boundary layer. The one thing that might have settled the argument with a single, undeniable object, a dated crater of the right age, had been examined and ruled out. The catastrophe, if it occurred, remained craterless, its evidence scattered and small and forever arguable. There is something almost mythic in this, a destruction so complete that it consumed even the proof of its own occurrence, leaving only dust and a flower and a stain in the ice. But not quite only those. For in a place far from the Greenland ice, in the dust of an ancient village in Syria, some researchers believe they found not scattered grains, but the actual scorched remains of a human settlement struck from the sky. And there the catastrophe, if it was one, wore a human face. On a low rise above the valley of the Euphrates in what is now Syria, there once stood one of the most important settlements in the entire human story. The site is called Abu Hureyra, and it was occupied across the very transition that concerns us, spanning the centuries before and after the onset of the Younger Dryas. What makes Abu Hureyra so significant is that its inhabitants were among the first people anywhere to take the fateful steps from gathering wild plants toward deliberately cultivating them, standing at the threshold of agriculture itself. Here, in the dust of this village, lies a record of one of the most consequential changes in the human condition, the slow turning from the wandering life of the hunter to the settled life of the farmer. And it is here that some researchers believe they have found evidence that the sky, at that very moment, came down upon a human home. Examining the sediments at the level corresponding to the onset of the Younger Dryas, a team of researchers reported finding within the village deposits the same kinds of materials proposed elsewhere as impact debris, but in concentrations and forms they regarded as especially telling. They described melt glass, sediment fused into glass at temperatures so extreme that no ordinary fire, no burning building, no hearth, no natural blaze could have produced it. They reported tiny spherules of melted rock and metal, melted grains of minerals that require staggering heat to transform, and the familiar microscopic diamonds. The temperatures implied by some of these materials, they argued, exceeded 2,000 degrees, far beyond anything human life at the time could generate. Something, they concluded, had subjected this village to a flash of heat from above, a cosmic airburst that detonated near the settlement and scorched it in an instant. If true, the implications are staggering and intimate in a way that scattered debris across an empty continent can never be. It would mean that the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas did not merely kill distant giants and chill faraway oceans, but that it struck a living human community, a village of people standing at the very dawn of farming, and devastated it in a single searing moment. It would mean that somewhere in the deep memory of our species there might lie the trace of an actual event, a day when the sky burned over a settlement of the first farmers. The people of Abu Hureyra would have been among the earliest humans to witness, and perhaps to remember, the kind of catastrophe that the impact hypothesis proposes. Their scorched home would be not a metaphor but a record, the catastrophe caught in the act of touching human lives, and yet the same caution that shadows every other piece of the impact evidence falls across Abu Hureyra as well. The interpretation rests on the same kinds of materials that have been so fiercely disputed elsewhere, the melt glass and spherules and tiny diamonds whose origin skeptics attribute to ordinary processes. Could the high temperatures, the critics ask, have been produced by something other than an airburst, by some terrestrial process, by contamination, by misinterpretation? The village did burn, certainly, but villages burn for many reasons, and the leap from fire to cosmic detonation is exactly the leap that the rest of the field has refused to make without overwhelming proof. Abu Hureyra is offered by the proponents as their most human and compelling evidence, and dismissed by the skeptics as the same arguable dust wearing a more dramatic costume. What cannot be disputed is the strangeness of the timing, the recurring strangeness that haunts every part of this story. Abu Hureyra sits at the threshold of the Younger Dryas, and it sits at the threshold of agriculture, and the two thresholds are the same threshold. As the cold returned and the wild foods grew scarce, the people of this region seem to have responded by beginning, tentatively, to tend and plant the grasses they had once merely gathered. The hardship of the Younger Dryas may have been one of the pressures that pushed humanity toward farming, toward settling, toward the entire chain of consequences that led to cities and writing and everything we call civilization. Whether or not an airburst scorched this particular village, the long cold that began at that moment appears to have been one of the forces that bent the human story toward a new and irreversible course. There is a thought here that lingers in the dark. If the Younger Dryas helped to drive the invention of agriculture, then the catastrophe, whatever its cause, was not only an ending but a beginning. The same event that killed the giants and scattered the Clovis and chilled the world may also have planted the seed of everything that followed, by making the old way of life impossible and forcing a new one into being. The advanced ancients of the title, if they existed in any form, would then have perished at the very moment that the civilization which replaced them was conceived. Destruction and creation folded into a single threshold, the world ending and the world beginning in the same dark line. But to speak of the catastrophe touching human lives, of villages scorched and memories formed, is to raise a question that the dust and the ice cannot answer. Did anyone remember? If something truly vast happened at the onset of the Younger Dryas, something witnessed by the first farmers and the scattered hunters across the world, would the memory of it have survived? Memory among preliterate peoples can be astonishingly long, carried in story and ritual and song across many generations. And there is a place, far to the north of Abu Hureyra, where some believe such a memory was not merely spoken but carved into stone, a place so ancient and so impossible that it has forced the entire world of archaeology to reconsider what the people of that age were capable of. To that place the search must now turn, to a hill in Turkey where hunter-gatherers raised pillars to the sky. In the southeast of Turkey, on a barren hilltop overlooking the plains, there rises a place that should not exist. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, and when archaeologists understood what they had found there, the discovery overturned one of the most basic assumptions about the human past. For at Göbekli Tepe, more than 11,000 years ago, people raised enormous pillars of carved stone, some standing taller than 3 men and weighing many tons, arranging them in great rings and decorating them with intricate reliefs of animals. The oldest layers of the site date to around 9,600 years before the Common Era, which places its construction near the end of the Younger Dryas, in the immediate aftermath of the long cold. And the people who built it had no agriculture, no cities, no writing, no metal, none of the things that monumental architecture was always assumed to require. The conventional understanding of human history held that monuments came after farming. First, the story went, people settled and learned to grow food, which produced surplus and population and social hierarchy, and only then, with the resources and organisation that agriculture provided, did they begin to raise great structures. Göbekli Tepe reverses this order. It was built by hunter-gatherers, by people who still live from the wild, and yet they quarried, shaped, transported and erected megaliths of staggering size and carved them with confident artistry. The labour required to build such a place is immense, the kind of coordinated effort that implies shared purpose, gathered crowds, sustained commitment across generations. People who had no farms and no kings nonetheless came together to build something monumental on that hill, again and again over many centuries. What were they building, and why? The structures appear to have been ceremonial rather than residential, places of gathering and ritual rather than dwelling. The great T-shaped pillars seem to represent abstracted human or more than human figures, some bearing carved arms and hands, belts and garments, as though they were stylized beings standing in the rings. And around them marched the animals, carved in relief with extraordinary skill, foxes and boars, snakes and scorpions, vultures and cranes. A whole bestiary frozen in the stone. This was a sacred place, by every appearance, a site of profound importance to the people who raised it, important enough to justify an outpouring of effort that defies the assumptions of what such people should have been able or willing to do, and important enough eventually that they deliberately buried it, for Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned and left to fall into ruin. At some point its builders or their descendants filled in the great enclosures, deliberately covering the pillars with rubble and earth, entombing the entire complex beneath an artificial hill. Why a people would labour for centuries to build something so monumental and then choose to bury it is a mystery in its own right. Was it an act of reverence, a sealing away of something holy? Was it an attempt to contain something feared? The burial preserved the site for us, hiding it so completely that for thousands of years it was nothing more than a low mound on the landscape, unrecognised, walked over, until late in the 20th century a German archaeologist understood that the strange stones poking from the soil were not a medieval cemetery but something vastly older. Göbekli Tepe matters profoundly to the mystery of the Younger Dryas for two reasons. The first is its timing, for it arose in the centuries just after the long cold ended, as the world warmed again and human life began its great transformation towards settlement and farming. The hill stands at the hinge of that transformation, a monument raised by the last of the old hunters as their world gave way to the new. The second reason is more contested, and it concerns one particular pillar among all the others, a stone covered in carvings that some researchers believe is not merely decorative or religious, but a deliberate record, a message left by people who had survived something terrible and wished to remember it, or to warn those who came after. They call it the Vulture Stone. The very existence of Göbekli Tepe is a lesson in humility, regardless of what any single pillar may or may not record. It demonstrates that the people of that distant age were capable of far more than we had imagined, capable of vision and organisation and artistry on a monumental scale, while still living as hunters and gatherers. If such people could build this, what else might they have done that left no trace, or whose traces we have not yet learned to recognise? The hill in Turkey stands as a standing rebuke to the confidence with which we draw the boundaries of the possible in the deep past. It reminds us that the silence of the record is not the same as the absence of achievement, and that the line between the advanced and the primitive ancients may be far blurrier than our categories allow. So the searcher who has followed the dark line through the soil, the platinum through the ice, the failed crater beneath Greenland, and the scorched dust of a Syrian village, now arrives at this buried hill and confronts a different kind of evidence altogether. Not the physical residue of a catastrophe, but the possibility of its memory, carved by human hands into stone that has lasted 11,000 years. The question is no longer only what happened, but whether anyone remembered it, and whether they tried to tell us. And the answer, if there is one, may be written on a single pillar, in a language of animals and symbols that a handful of researchers claim to have begun, at last, to read. The pillar in question is known by its catalogue number and by its popular name, the Vulture Stone, and it stands within one of the great ring enclosures of Göbekli Tepe. Its carvings are unusually rich and strange even by the standards of that strange place. Across its broad face march a procession of animals rendered in relief, and among them a large bird with outstretched wings, often identified as a vulture, which appears to hold or balance a round disc above one wing. Below the animals, near the base, is carved the figure of a man, and the figure is headless. The scene has the quality of a deliberate composition, an arrangement that feels purposeful, even narrative, as though it were meant to convey something specific to anyone who knew how to read it. In the year 2017, two researchers from a university in Scotland published a provocative interpretation of this pillar. They proposed that the animals carved upon it are not merely animals, but representations of constellations, star patterns rendered as the creatures the ancients saw in them. By matching the carved beast to the positions of these proposed constellations, and by accounting for the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that gradually shifts the apparent position of the stars across the millennia, they argued that the scene on the Vulture Stone encodes a specific date, and the date they arrived at fell near the year 10,950 before the Common Era, with a margin of a few centuries, which is to say remarkably close to the proposed onset of the Younger Dryas and to the platinum spike recorded in the Greenland ice. The pillar they suggested was a date stamp, a memorial in stone to the catastrophe of the Long Cold. In this reading, the round disc held by the vulture represents the sun, and the headless man at the base represents death and catastrophe, the toll of the event being remembered. The whole composition becomes a message across time, carved by people perhaps 1,500 years after the catastrophe itself, preserving the memory of a comet that fell and a world that nearly ended, and recording the date in the only permanent language they possessed, the arrangement of the stars. If the interpretation is correct, it would be astonishing. Evidence that the memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe survived for more than 1,000 years among preliterate peoples, and was considered important enough to encode in monumental stone. It would mean the advanced ancients, or those who came after them, had tried to leave us a record, and that the record was waiting on a hill in Turkey all along. But the interpretation is fiercely contested, and the objections come most forcefully from the very archaeologists who excavated the site and knew its stones most intimately. They have argued that the round disc above the wing is not the sun at all, but a representation of a disembodied human head, a symbol that appears elsewhere in the imagery of the region, and connects to beliefs about death and the journey of the soul. The vulture, in this reading, is a vulture, a bird associated across the ancient Near East with death and the dead, a creature that carried the deceased into the next world. The headless man is part of a funerary symbolism, a depiction of death and the afterlife, not a code for a cosmic catastrophe. The animals, they insist, are animals, rich with meaning in the religious world of these people, but not a star map, and the attempt to read constellations into them imposes a modern obsession upon an ancient mind that did not share it. The dispute over the Vulture Stone is, in miniature, the dispute over the entire mystery. One side sees a deliberate record of catastrophe, a message about a comet and a date, fitting neatly into the impact hypothesis and confirming that the event was real and remembered. The other side sees the projection of a seductive theory onto ambiguous imagery, the finding of patterns that the mind wishes to find, a star map conjured from a funerary scene by people who already believed in the catastrophe and went looking for its confirmation. And as with the microscopic diamonds and the magnetic spheres, the evidence itself cannot easily settle the matter, because the stone says nothing in words. It shows a vulture, a disc, a headless man, a march of beasts, and into that silence each interpreter reads the story they are prepared to read. What gives the catastrophe reading its strange persistence, despite the objections, is the same thing that has kept the whole impact hypothesis alive against all its difficulties. It is the recurring proximity of dates. The proposed reading of the pillar lands near the onset of the Younger Dryas. The platinum spike in the ice lands near the onset of the Younger Dryas. The black mat, the extinctions, the disappearance of the Clovis all cluster around that same narrow window. Each individual line of evidence can be challenged, reinterpreted, dismissed. But the persistence with which independent threads keep pointing toward the same moment is the thing that refuses to let the question die, even in the minds of those who doubt each thread on its own. And there is a deeper resonance to the idea of memory carved in stone, one that reaches beyond Göbekli Tepe and beyond the formal arguments of archaeology. For if the people of that age remembered a catastrophe and tried to record it, then the record need not have been confined to a single pillar on a single hill. Memory takes many forms, and the most durable of all is not stone but story. The tale told and retold around the fire, passed from the dying to the living across uncountable generations. If a real catastrophe scarred the human imagination at the dawn of the modern world, its memory might survive not only in carved vultures, but in the oldest stories our species tells, the stories of a world destroyed by water and fire, of a great flood that swept away the old order and left only a remnant to begin again. And those stories, as it happens, are everywhere. Among the oldest written stories that survive from any human culture, the same dark tale appears again and again in lands far apart, among peoples who could not have shared it. A great flood sent or unleashed upon the world, drowning the old order, destroying nearly all of humanity, sparing only a remnant who survived to begin the world anew. The ancient peoples of Mesopotamia told of it, in the epic of their hero who sought immortality and met a man who had survived the deluge, warned beforehand to build a vessel and fill it with living things. The same essential story echoes in the account preserved in the Hebrew scriptures, the ark and the rain, and the dove. The ancient Greeks told of a couple who survived a flood sent by the gods, and repopulated the earth by casting stones behind them. In India, a tale was told of a man warned by a fish to build a boat against the coming waters. Across the world, in cultures that had no contact with one another, the memory of a world destroyed by flood recurs with a persistence that demands explanation. There are sober and sufficient reasons why such stories might arise independently. Humans have always settled near water, by rivers and coasts and lakes, and floods are among the most common and devastating disasters that any settled people can face. A culture living beside a great river that periodically overflows, drowning fields and villages, needs no shared origin to produce a flood myth. The story of the deluge may simply be the natural product of the human experience of water, dangerous and life-giving at once, written into the imagination of every people who ever feared the rising of the river or the surging of the sea. By this account, the universality of flood myths reflects nothing more than the universality of floods, and there is no need to seek a single ancient catastrophe behind them all. And yet some have wondered whether the recurrence runs deeper than local floods can explain. The end of the Ice Age was a time of genuinely catastrophic flooding on a scale the world has not seen since. As the great ice sheets melted, sea levels rose dramatically, drowning vast tracts of land that had been dry throughout the entire span of the human story until then. Coastlines retreated, islands vanished, land bridges that peoples had walked across disappeared beneath the waves. Enormous lakes of meltwater, dammed by ice, burst their barriers and unleashed floods of almost unimaginable violence across the land. The people who lived through these centuries witnessed the literal drowning of the world they knew, the slow and sometimes sudden swallowing of their homelands by the rising sea. If any era could have burned the memory of a great flood into the deep imagination of humanity, it was the end of the Ice Age, the very era of the Younger Dryas and its aftermath. In this light, the flood myths take on a more haunting aspect. They might be not the scattered products of local disasters, but the distorted echoes of a real and global transformation, the memory of the drowning of the Ice Age world, carried down through hundreds of generations and finally written into the oldest stories when writing was at last invented. The remnant who survive in the myths, the chosen few who outlast the deluge to begin again, might be a folk memory of survival itself, of the peoples who endured the great changes and passed on the tale of a world that was lost. The advanced ancients, if they existed, might survive only here, as the drowned civilization that the flood erased, remembered dimly as a golden age before the waters came, its true nature lost beneath layers of retelling. It was precisely this intuition that led an ancient philosopher to record, in two of his dialogues, the story of a great island civilization that flourished in a distant age and was destroyed in a single terrible day and night, swallowed by the sea. He placed the destruction of this civilization some 9,000 years before his own time, which would set it strikingly near the era of the Younger Dryas, and he claimed the tale had been carried from the priests of Egypt, who kept records far older than those of his own people. Whether he meant the story as history, as moral allegory, or as a blend of both, has been argued for more than 2,000 years. But the tale of the drowned advanced civilization set at the end of the Ice Age has never lost its grip on the human imagination, and it has become the seed of countless theories about a lost world that perished in the catastrophe of the Long Cold. To weigh these stories fairly is to walk a difficult line. The careful mind knows that myths are not history, that they shift and grow with every retelling, that the human imagination needs no real catastrophe to invent a flood, and that the resemblances between distant flood tales may be exaggerated or coincidental. The temptation to read a single literal event behind every deluge myth is exactly the kind of pattern-seeking that has led many seekers astray, finding in scattered stories the confirmation of a theory they brought with them. And yet the careful mind also knows that the end of the Ice Age really did drown a vast portion of the inhabited world, that real peoples really did watch their lands vanish beneath the rising sea, and that the memory of so vast a loss would not easily be forgotten. The truth, if there is one, lies somewhere in the uneasy space between dismissing the myths and believing them too literally. What the flood stories add to the mystery is not proof, but resonance. A sense that the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas, if it was a catastrophe, did not vanish without a trace from the human soul. The dust may be arguable, and the crater may be missing, and the carved pillar may be misread, but the stories remain, told by nearly every people on Earth, of a world that ended in water and a remnant that survived to remember. And it is from this deep well of myth and memory that the most radical reading of the entire Younger Dryas mystery draws its power. The claim that there really was a lost advanced civilization, that it really did perish in the catastrophe, and that the official history of our species has been written with a missing chapter, a chapter the establishment refuses to acknowledge. The boldest version of the Younger Dryas story does not content itself with comets and currents and dying giants. It proposes something far more provocative, that before the catastrophe, there existed a civilization of real sophistication, a culture of knowledge and craft and perhaps even science, whose existence has been erased from the accepted history of humanity. According to this view, the cataclysm at the onset of the Younger Dryas did not merely kill animals and scatter hunters. It destroyed an advanced human society, drowning its coastal cities beneath the rising seas, scattering its survivors, and erasing its achievements so thoroughly that the peoples who came after remembered it only as myth, as the golden age before the flood, as the gods who taught early humanity the arts of civilization. This is the lost civilization hypothesis, and it has reached far more people through popular books and documentaries than any peer-reviewed paper ever could. The argument runs along several lines. It points to sites like Göbekli Tepe as proof that the people of that age were capable of far more than mainstream archaeology long allowed, and asks how a monument so sophisticated could appear so suddenly, without any visible tradition of development behind it, unless the knowledge to build it came from somewhere, from some older source now lost. It points to the flood myths as the folk memory of the drowned civilization. It points to ancient structures around the world whose construction it claims conventional history cannot adequately explain, suggesting they are far older than admitted, or that they preserve knowledge inherited from the vanished culture. And it points to the catastrophe itself, the real and documented Younger Dryas, as the mechanism of erasure, the event violent enough to wipe a civilization from the earth and leave us mistaking its absence for proof it never was. There is an undeniable appeal to this vision, and it is worth understanding why it captivates so many. It transforms the deep past from a slow and undramatic climb, out of ignorance, into a story of loss and forgetting, of a golden age destroyed and a knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered. It flatters a suspicion many people hold, that the official account of things is incomplete, that the experts are too cautious or too proud to admit how much they do not know. It connects the scattered fragments, the impossible hill in Turkey, the worldwide flood myths, the philosopher's drowned island, the documented catastrophe, into a single grand narrative that explains them all at once. And it offers the deep emotional satisfaction of a mystery solved, of the missing chapter found, of the advanced ancients restored to a history that had forgotten them. But the appeal of a story is no measure of its truth, and here the lost civilization hypothesis collides hard with the discipline of evidence. For all its sweep, it suffers from a fundamental problem. A genuine advanced civilization, the kind that builds cities and develops technologies, leaves enormous quantities of physical evidence behind. It leaves not one buried hill but countless settlements, refuse heaps, tools, the residue of metalworking and agriculture and trade, distributed across the landscape and preserved in the layers of the earth. The peoples we know to have existed, even the preliterate hunter-gatherers, left abundant traces. A widespread advanced civilization that vanished only 12,000 years ago should have left vastly more, and despite intense searching, that overwhelming body of evidence has not been found. The drowned coastline argument that the cities lie beneath the risen sea can explain the loss of some sites but not the near-total absence everywhere on land. Mainstream archaeology answers the lost civilization hypothesis not with contempt, though contempt is sometimes what it offers, but with the patient insistence that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and that the evidence simply is not there. Göbekli Tepe, the archaeologists say, is astonishing precisely because it shows what hunter-gatherers could do, not because it requires a lost teacher civilization to explain it. The flood myths, they say, are explained by real floods without need of a single drowned Atlantis. The ancient structures said to be inexplicable are, on examination, explicable by the known capabilities of the peoples who built them. The lost civilization in this view is a story imposed upon the past by the human hunger for lost golden ages, not a conclusion drawn from the ground, and yet the dismissal, however well grounded, leaves something unsatisfied, because the establishment account has its own genuine gaps that the radical theories exploit. There remain real anomalies, real surprises, real moments where the orthodox picture has had to be revised. Göbekli Tepe itself being the great example, a discovery that overturned settled assumptions and proved that the cautious consensus had underestimated the ancients before. The lost civilization hypothesis feeds on every such revision, every case where the experts were forced to admit they were wrong, building from these real episodes a general suspicion that the official history is hiding or missing far more than it admits. The theory is almost certainly wrong in its grand claims, and yet it draws its strength from a real and recurring truth that the deep past has surprised us before and may surprise us again. So the searcher is left in a peculiar position with respect to the most dramatic reading of all. The evidence does not support the existence of a lost advanced civilization in the sense the theory proposes, and the burden of proof, which lies on those making so vast a claim, has not been met. To believe in the drowned civilization is to believe in something for which the ground has not yielded the necessary proof, and yet to dismiss it entirely is to forget how recently the same establishment confidently declared that hunter-gatherers could not build monuments, only to be proven wrong by a hill in Turkey. The honest position is neither belief nor contempt, but a wary suspension, holding the radical story at arm's length, while refusing to pretend that the orthodox account has explained everything it claims to explain. What remains, beneath all the speculation about lost civilizations and carved warnings and drowned golden ages, is the hard core of genuine mystery that no theory has dissolved. The cold really did return. The giants really did vanish. The Clovis really did disappear. The platinum really is in the ice. Göbekli Tepe really does stand, impossibly early on its hill. These are not fringe claims but established facts, and they cluster around a single moment in time in a way that no one has fully explained. The lost civilization hypothesis is a wrong answer to a real question, but the question it answers wrongly is real, and it will not be silenced by pointing out the wrongness of one bold reply. The mystery survives the failure of its most dramatic explanation, as it has survived every explanation offered so far, waiting in the dark for evidence that has not yet come. To understand why the Younger Dryas mystery endures, one must look closely at how the scientific argument has actually unfolded, for it is a study in how difficult it is to settle a question when the evidence is small, scattered, and open to interpretation. In recent years, the dispute reached a kind of climax. a large group of skeptical researchers published an enormous and exhaustive critique, a document running to tens of thousands of words in which they sought to refute the impact hypothesis comprehensively, marshalling every objection and arguing that the proposed evidence was inconsistent, irreproducible, and unconvincing across the board. It was meant to be a final accounting, a closing of the case, a demonstration that the whole edifice of the impact hypothesis rested on misidentified particles and wishful interpretation. The proponents did not accept the verdict. They replied with a rebuttal of their own, arguing that the critics had offered no new evidence but only reinterpretation, that many of their objections rested on faulty reasoning, and that the impact hypothesis remained supported by a substantial body of work published across many journals over nearly 2 decades, describing the same suite of materials at dozens of boundary sites across multiple continents. They pointed in particular to newer evidence that they regarded as harder to dismiss, including reports of shocked quartz, a form of the mineral that is generally accepted to be produced only by the extraordinary pressures of a cosmic impact. If genuine impact shocked quartz could be confirmed at the boundary, it would be a far stronger signature than the contested diamonds and spheres, a material whose formation is difficult to explain by any ordinary terrestrial process. This is the state of the argument as it stands, a standoff between 2 camps that have spent years unable to convince each other, each accusing the other of bias, each pointing to evidence the other refuses to accept. The skeptics see a hypothesis that should have died long ago kept alive by a dedicated group who reinterpret ordinary phenomena as catastrophe, and who have failed to produce the one thing that would settle the matter, a crater or an unambiguous, independently reproducible signature. The proponents see a hypothesis steadily accumulating support, resisted by a conservative establishment unwilling to accept a dramatic conclusion, their evidence dismissed not because it is weak, but because it is inconvenient. Both narratives are coherent. Both cannot be entirely true. The deepest difficulty, the one that gives the skeptics their strongest position, remains the absence of a crater and the problem of reproducibility. Science advances by results that independent teams can confirm, and the impact evidence has suffered from the troubling pattern that some laboratories find the proposed signatures, while others, examining similar materials, do not. When the central claims of a hypothesis cannot be reliably reproduced by all who test them, the scientific community is right to withhold acceptance, however suggestive the positive results may be. The nanodiamonds, in particular, have been a battleground of exactly this kind, claimed by some, denied by others, the disagreement turning on the fine details of how the tiny crystals are identified and what they are made of. The deepest difficulty for the skeptics, in turn, is the stubborn persistence of the boundary itself and the clustering of evidence around it. Even if every individual signature can be questioned, the skeptics must still account for why so many independent lines of inquiry keep converging on the same narrow moment, the cold and the extinctions and the cultural rupture and the platinum and the contested debris. The conventional meltwater explanation can account for the cooling, but says little about the rest, and the skeptics have not always offered a unified alternative that ties the threads together as neatly as the impact hypothesis claims to. To refute the impact is not the same as to explain the convergence, and the convergence is the thing that will not go away. There is a lesson here about the nature of knowledge itself, about the difference between the questions science can readily answer and the questions that resist it. When a phenomenon leaves abundant, clear, reproducible evidence, the truth can be established and the argument ends. But when the evidence is faint and scattered and ambiguous, when it consists of particles too small to see and patterns open to interpretation, the truth may hover forever out of reach, and reasonable people may disagree without end. The Younger Dryas mystery is a question of the second kind, a question whose evidence is precisely faint enough to sustain endless argument, and precisely suggestive enough to forbid surrender. It sits in the uncomfortable zone where certainty is impossible, but indifference is also impossible. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is that the question remains genuinely open, not in the false sense that fringe theories sometimes claim, where any wild idea is treated as equally valid, but in the real sense that careful, qualified researchers continue to disagree about the fundamental cause of one of the most dramatic episodes in the recent history of the planet. The impact hypothesis is not established, but neither is it dead. The meltwater explanation accounts for much, but not all. The lost civilization hypothesis is unsupported but feeds on real gaps, and the mystery itself, the cluster of endings bound to that single dark line, sits at the centre of it all, explained by no theory completely, abandoned by no honest investigator entirely. What does it mean to live in a world that may have ended once before, in an age so deep that we cannot be sure whether it ended in fire or in water, or merely in the slow chilling of the sea? The searcher who has followed this trail to its end is left not with an answer, but with a changed sense of the ground beneath their feet, a new awareness of how thin and recent and fragile our knowledge of ourselves truly is. The certainties of history reach back only a few thousand years, and behind them lies a darkness vast enough to swallow whole worlds without a sound. We walk upon the black mat without knowing it is there. We tell the flood stories without remembering what they remember. Consider what the earth itself seems to be saying, in its patient and indifferent way. It laid down a dark line and sealed an old world beneath it. It caught a trace of metal in the ice and kept it for 13,000 years. It allowed the bones of giants to rest undisturbed in the frozen ground and the dry caves, and it let a flower bloom over their graves and lend its name to the catastrophe. It permitted a people to raise great stones on a hill and then to bury them, and it kept the buried stones safe through all the centuries until they were found again. The earth is not trying to tell us anything. It simply keeps its records, faithfully, without regard for whether we can read them. And the whole drama of the Younger Dryas mystery is the drama of human beings standing before those records and straining to understand a language that was never meant for us. There is a particular vertigo that comes from the realization that a society can vanish so completely that its very existence becomes a matter of doubt. Whether or not a lost civilization perished in the long cold, the simple fact that the question cannot be definitively answered is itself the most sobering lesson of all. It means that the silence of the past is not proof of its emptiness. It means that worlds can end and be forgotten, that knowledge can be gathered and then lost, that the achievements of an age can crumble back into the indistinguishable dark from which we cannot recover them. The advanced ancients may be a fantasy, or they may be a forgotten truth, but either way they stand as a warning about the impermanence of everything that any people has ever built or known. And what of memory, the fragile thread on which all of this hangs? If the people of Göbekli Tepe carved a memory of catastrophe into stone, that memory has outlasted everything else they made, outlasted their language, their names, their beliefs, their entire way of life. If the flood myths preserve the memory of a drowned world, they have carried it across hundreds of generations through nothing more durable than the act of telling. Memory is the one thing that reaches across the dark line, more lasting than bone, more lasting in some ways than stone, and yet endlessly distorted in the carrying, until we can no longer be certain whether the stories remember a real catastrophe or only the human fear of one. We are left holding fragments of a memory that may not be ours, of an event we cannot confirm, told to us by ancestors we cannot question. So the long cold recedes back into the dark from which it briefly emerged into the light of inquiry, taking its secrets with it. Somewhere beneath the melted ice of the north, if anything fell there, the wound has healed and left no scar. Somewhere in the scattered dust of the boundary layer, the truth waits in particles too small and too ambiguous to compel agreement. Somewhere in the oldest stories, a drowned world is remembered or imagined, and no one can say for certain which. The flower that gave the catastrophe its name still grows in the cold places of the earth, small and white and indifferent, blooming as it bloomed when the giants fell, keeping no record and asking no questions, while far below it, in the patient layers of the ground, the dark line runs on through the deep silence, dividing the world we know from the world we lost, or never had, and will perhaps never be able to tell apart.